She walked into the night with the rain still clinging to her coat, strings of light bending on the wet pavement like a trail of questions. The city smelled of oil and coffee and the faint sweetness of something someone had burned in a hurry. Luna kept her guitar case closed against her knee, as if it were a small, plaintive animal. The case had been taped in 2 places and bore a sticker whose edges were worn down into the shape of a boat. In her pocket was a photograph, edges softened by years of being folded and unfolded, a blurred image of a woman with a smile that did not entirely reach her eyes. The photo was folded twice, and sometimes when she thought no one watched, Luna would smooth the paper with a fingertip until the creases felt like parts of herself. At the glass doors of the studio, the world changed. Inside, lights waited in neat ranks like a miniature army. Production monitors hummed. The publicists wore coats that seemed designed to deter weather and pity at once. A table sat center stage with a single white plate on it, the ceramic square under a pool of theatrical light. The plate was spotless enough to be obscene. Its presence had been argued over like a costume choice. Someone had said, "The plate sells the frame," and everyone understood the language of frames. In the cramped room behind the stage, Antoine unfolded the plan in clipped sentences. We get the singer on stage, the camera widens, the plate is visible, someone in the audience comments, people will react. Empathy drives engagement. He kept his voice the color of trade agreements. Marie, the assistant with the kind hands, swallowed and said nothing, but her face told a different story. Elena, a makeup runner who had started years ago volunteering at a shelter, flinched when the plate was mentioned. She had seen how a single image could be used to press people into neat, consumable feelings. Shock, guilt, then the softening click of a donate button. They presented Luna with the stage like a small island, and the plate like a test. "It's part of the set," Antoine offered, as if the plate were merely an ugly prop the show wanted to pretend it didn't notice. "Play to it," someone advised, half jest, half instruction. Outside the dressing room door, the crew buzzed with practicalities. Camera angles, lighting cues, the judges lined to prod laughter. Inside, a volunteer named Karim sat on a folding chair, smoothing the strings of Luna's guitar with gentle, deliberate motions. He had a ledger of bus routes tattooed into his memory and a soft laugh that made people trust him. He had found Luna at a soup line a month earlier and had tried, without ceremony, to anchor her to 3 things: a warm meal, a place to sleep, and somewhere to keep a guitar that mattered. Luna agreed to go on because there was a small, honest hunger in her that had nothing to do with theatrical pity. To be heard. The idea of her voice leaking into the rooms of strangers felt more dangerous and more necessary than any arrangement. She thought of the woman in the photograph, someone who had hummed lullabies under the fluttering light of a broken bulb, and she thought of how words could map the place where absence lived. She folded her hands around the neck of the guitar like prayer. The camera's breath was hot on her face when she stepped into the light. The plate waited like an accusation. From the cheap seats to the LEDs, the air smelled of perfume and reheated laughter. The judges sat as if on small islands of authority, their pens poised like verdicts. Sophie, one of the judges, kept her face even, but in the half-light her jaw tightened, as if she was struggling between something she had been trained to do, score stories, and something older that made her uncomfortable at cheap theatrical cruelty. Her judge made the joke predicted by the producers. It landed like a stone thrown into a glass. There was a ripple of laughter, a few camera clicks. The audience filled the pause with polite chuckles. Luna felt the plate as a small, inert thing on stage, but everyone knew what it represented, a visual shorthand meant to turn a human into a headline. It was a temptation to the crowd to feel, then move on. She breathed. The first chord was small and fragile enough to seem private. It sounded like someone unlocking a door. Her voice began as if from behind another life, thin, shaped by cold nights and the way rooftops remember feet. The lyrics were not a plan of clever lines. They were architecture of small things. A line about the way rain made the street catch like a mirror. A line about a warm hand that left too early. A line about a broken watch and the way mornings kept beginning anyway. She sang phrases that tasted of bread and the smoke of bus engines. She sang as if cataloguing a life that would otherwise be compressed to a plate under a light. Slowly, the room shifted. The cameras, placed and instructed to catch pity, instead found a rhythm settling inside people. Laughter thinned to quiet at the edges. The judge's smile began to shrink. When Luna sang of a photograph kept under a pillow, something in the room leaned forward, as if to bridge the distance. She did not ask for anything. She merely named the fact of her hunger and the way music seemed to hold time in one hand. The song elongated the room until strangers could sit in it together without being asked. After the second chorus, someone in the front row covered their mouth. A boy near the aisle had tears, making sure he wouldn't miss his words. A woman in the back recognized a melody and closed her eyes, moving her fingers in the air as though she could stitch the memory back to life. The judge, who had cracked the joke, blinked and, for the first time, could not find a shape for a closing remark. Antoine's forehead formed a crease he hadn't planned for. When the last note hung in the air, the silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was a living thing. It made people uncomfortable in the best way, like a room suddenly aware of its own walls. Then applause rose, not the polite immediate clap of shows, but the kind that builds from an ache and cannot be reheated. It felt like a catching. Cameras panned, catching hands and faces, and for a beat the plate looked ridiculous. A small white square whose intention had been swallowed by something larger. Behind the camera banks, a producer said, "We didn't expect," and stopped because there were no instruction sheets for this. Elena put a hand on Luna's shoulder in the wings. No words. Karim handed Luna a paper cup of water, as if offering a truce from the day. On monitors and phones in an instant, people were uploading, tagging, sharing. The clip traveled like a wound that would not close. It found spaces and names it did not know had been waiting. The video that was meant to be a trap had exploded into evidence of a voice that refused to be framed. If this were only a moment on television, it might have died there. A good hour of ratings, and then replacement by a cooking segment. But people carried the sound of that voice out into the city like a seed. Overnight, the clip multiplied across feeds and channels. Comments swelled, many of them tender, some angry, several that tried to pin motives like badges. Screenshots of the plate circulate with captions about taste and ethics, the production's internal messages. At first nothing, then patchy, then a steady drip, became a new kind of artifact. Someone leaked an email exchange where a line read, in icy corporate shorthand, "Visuals prioritized, empathy angle advised." That email seemed to confirm a suspicion many already carried. The plate had been chosen as bait. With virality came investigation. Newsrooms knocked on doors. Advocates for the homeless asked prudent questions rather than cheap indignation. What protections were in place? What consent had been obtained? How did the show's staff justify framing a person in a way that risked the dignity of an already vulnerable life? Lawyers wrote to the network in general terms, asking for clarity about protocols. Sponsors, cautious of public perception, asked their own questions, and then, within a week, several withdrew ads until a full review was completed. In the swell of public reaction, a narrative began to shift the ground under the story. A reporter, following loose threads of Luna's past, found an adoption record in a court registry, a line of paper that connected a private donor, an individual known for philanthropic investments in education, to a name that matched Luna's childhood surname. The detail slid into the news like a stone into a quiet pool, making ripples. Social feeds exploded with the headline, "The Billionaire's Adopted Daughter? How does that change the frame?" The moment the phrase appeared, something else began. People rushed to tidy the image into a story they recognized. Some commenters declared that the revelation proved bad faith, that Luna had been playing a role, that she had engineered attention. Others insisted the revelation proved the burden of decades of inequality sat even on those with privileged names. The conversation became a second performance, one in which truth could be pressed to fit preconceived narratives. Luna read the articles as if they were social weather reports. The papers called her the billionaire's adopted daughter, and then added commentary as if that label drew a line one way or another. She felt the way naming could simple the world into binary arguments. In truth, the adoption had been part of her history, but not a full explanation. She had been a child when she was brought into a different home. The arrangement had been complicated by distance, absences, choices made by adults, and a life that kept turning in ways no single paper could capture. The billionaire in question, he was a public figure, too large to be reduced to a single blame or redemption scene, had his own web of charities and directors. In that web, Luna had been a name on a file, and a person who later made choices that carried her back to the street for reasons that included longing and anger, and a desire to understand the life she witnessed daily. Sophie, the judge who had flinched on stage, watched the media spiral with a private discomfort. She phoned the network and asked for copies of consent forms, for protocols, for the name of the person who had greenlit the plate. She asked Elena and Marie about the backstage conversations and was told the honest things. Some had raised objections, others had shrugged, saying, "It's what gets watched." For Sophie, the revelation of Luna's past did not erase the harm of the frame. Instead, it complicated it, forcing her to confront how her own laugh had been part of a moment that turned a person into a narrative device. The legal follow-through, once it started, moved in ways that were deliberate and imperfect. Advocacy organizations lodged a complaint with the network's oversight body, arguing that the production had arranged circumstances that risked exploitation. The network launched an internal review, and the show suspended a promotional segment, pending the outcome. Sponsors asked for timelines, and then asked for results. The internal emails from production, when they leaked, showed an uncomfortable calculus: metrics versus human outcomes. Those emails did not prove malice. They revealed a system that measured attention with little appetite for the cost in human dignity. At the same time as the scrutiny unfolded, people reached out in practical ways. A local community trust offered to pay for repairs to Luna's guitar and covered the cost of a set of lessons to help her rebuild a repertoire. A small music school offered rehearsal space free for 6 months. The city's shelter system connected Luna to a caseworker who helped retrieve identification paperwork and apply for benefits she had lacked in the confusion of moving between places. Rather than a single check with a headline, these were incremental stitches: a repaired string here, a bank account opened there, an appointment with a counselor who knew the language of trauma and slow rebuilding. The settlement that the network and production agreed to, once talk turned into negotiation, was not a cinematic check handed over in the rain. It involved an agreement to fund a community program for vulnerable youth musicians, to establish clearer consent protocols for guests in broadcasts, and to allocate part of a discretionary fund to be managed by an independent advisory board. The advisory board included shelter workers, a representative from the music school, and an ethicist invited to guard against tokenism. The fund committed support to a series of monthly workshops, a modest stipend for participants, and the setting up of a repair fund for instruments damaged or neglected. The numbers, practical and unspectacular, were meant to be a step towards structural change rather than a headline. They promised, for example, a 6-month program of weekly workshops, equipment repairs for up to 20 young musicians each year, and support for administrative needs like IDs and initial school supplies. The criteria for allocation were published and overseen by the advisory board to reduce the chance that money would be used as a PR patch rather than a tool of real assistance. In the weeks that followed the performance, media narratives battled each other. Some streams tried to make Luna into a symbol for everything wrong with the industry. Others attempted to paint her as a beneficiary of an elite's hidden charity. Luna refused both simplifications with the quiet of someone who understood that one voice cannot carry the weight of every opinion in the world. She kept singing, though now she refused to speak to everyone who wanted a quote. She had a new manager in a small non-profit who handled inquiries, and a lawyer who explained, patiently, what privacy could still mean in a world that wanted to know. Months later, Luna stood in a community center with a repaired guitar, sitting like a small miracle in her hands. Children from the neighborhood came clutching instruments that had not been tuned since they were gifted. One boy brought a drum with a patched skin and eyes like light bulbs. The room smelled of boiled coffee and new strings. A banner that had once been intended as a publicity backdrop now read simply, "Music Workshop." The plate from the television stage, clean, starched, and surprisingly intact, hung behind a small display case in the foyer, with a placard beside it that read, in modest letters, "A warning and a promise." The plate had been donated to the center to keep as a reminder, never again a prop for someone else's empathy. The workshops were practical. They taught chords and how to hold a mic, yes, but also the business of music, how to arrange a set, how to register a song, how to apply for small grants. The advisory fund paid for a technician to fix wiring in the center and for a small stipend, so participants could travel to auditions without pleading. A social worker helped some young people apply for identification cards and enroll in adult education classes. A former producer, moved by guilt and then conviction, volunteered to teach a class on media literacy, how to negotiate consent, how to spot framing tactics, how to say no when it mattered. The program published an annual public report with transparent accounting so the community could see that money intended for care did not dissolve into corporate pockets. Luna's role shifted from performer to teacher without fireworks. She led exercises in listening, asking one student to play a short phrase while the rest tried to repeat it by ear. The room would lean in, intentionally soft. She taught songs that were not her own story, but held lessons about noticing. A verse about a mother who made bread even when the flour line was nearly gone. A chorus about the long patience of someone who knows slow repair. Children who had never been asked what they heard suddenly found language for sorrow and for hope. The guitar, once a device for keeping warm, became a tool for building other people's confidence. Sometimes, after a session ended, they would gather in a circle and eat. The food was simple, soup, fresh bread, and no one put it on a plate as a show. Plates were there for eating, not for spectacle. On those evenings, the conversation was soft. People talked about the ways they had been seen and unseen, how kindness sometimes arrived through the least glamorous veins, how accountability could be an ongoing practice rather than a one-time statement. Luna, who had been called many headlines, listened more than she spoke. She sometimes took one of the old photographs out and smoothed the edges, showing a younger face to those who asked why she had returned to the street after being brought into another life. "It was my choice to learn," she said simply. "Choices can be messy. Not everyone was satisfied. Critics continued to argue about how the narrative could be co-opted, about whether the network settlement was enough, about the complicity of viewers who clicked first and questioned later. Sophie, the judge, published an essay about the ethics of spectacle. She wrote about how a laugh can be a failure and how people in positions of cultural authority have to police their own reflexes. Antoine left the show after a slow erosion of support and took a job producing small documentaries tied to community projects where the camera's gaze had to be earned and protocols were strict. He learned in a less spectacular way the difficulty of making content that did not trade in people's pain. The billionaire, whose name the papers had used and then retreated from, issued a statement that did not absolve him from public scrutiny but demanded nuance. He had, the statement said, supported causes and had been involved in adoptions sponsored by his foundation. He regretted that a situation he had some connection to had become a vehicle of harm. He offered additional funding to regional programs unconnected to the network's settlement, but the Community Advisory Board insisted on independent oversight. They refused money seamed with conditions. The relationship between vast wealth and public responsibility remained unresolved, a tangle rather than a tidy narrative thread which suited some people and made others uncomfortable. The point was not to score moral points, but to insist that accountability be real and ongoing. Through it all, Luna sang. She took simple jobs to keep the center running in its early days, cleaning, organizing instrument donations, teaching. She learned to navigate interviews with boundaries. People who had once watched for the drama found themselves drawn into the quieter work of repair, making sure that the workshops continued, overseeing the repair fund, advocating for simple things like the provision of lockers and warm clothing on nights the city dipped below freezing. The work was block by block, person by person. It refused the magic of a single night to fix everything. A year after the night on stage, a small concert took place in the community hall. It was not lavish. The lights were practical, the audience a patchwork of neighbors, workshop alumni, a few cautious journalists and volunteers who had become friends. The guitar looked worn in the way good instruments do, the repair work visible but tasteful. Luna stood and played a set that included songs she'd written about ordinary acts, the way someone fixed a sweater without asking for thanks, the sound of a neighbor humming while cooking, the careful way someone might place a boot by a door so the street wouldn't take it. Her voice had the depth of weathered wood and the clarity of something that had practiced being honest. After the show, a small plaque was unveiled in the center's meeting room, a dedication to voices that were nearly used and voices that needed space. The plaque did not name the network or the billionaire. It named the work and the people who did it. Volunteers, the advisory board, the small donors who kept the repair fund alive. The plate from the stage was behind glass in the foyer, and children were often sent there to read the placard before their classes, to remember why consent mattered and why a plate meant more than food. There were important practical changes beyond the workshops. The show's company adopted clearer consent guidelines. Guests would receive full briefings ahead of time. Any staging that included vulnerable visual cues would need independent approval, and production teams were required to include a welfare officer when working with people referred by social services. Local stations reached out to shelters to establish lines of communication before coverage was arranged. These were not perfect reforms. They were imperfect human attempts to repair systems that had become too clever with pain. When the press returned months later, asking about the billionaire's adopted daughter label, Luna answered in the quiet she had cultivated. "I'm not an emblem," she told a small interviewer. "I'm someone who sings. There are people who need help in a lot of different ways. Money can help, but only when it's paired with listening and patience." Her words were not a rebuke, but a reminder of how complicated rescue could be. She refused performance from anyone else. The story taught some hard lessons. It showed how media frames can flatten a person into an object of pity, and how a single staged prop could transform a real life into a spectacle. It showed the power of a voice to change the room, and how public pressure could force institutions to do the slow work of accountability. It also showed the limits of headline morality. A revelation of adoption did not answer the question of who bore responsibility for neglect, nor did it absolve powerful people from the consequences of their choices. The revelation complicated the story rather than simplifying it. Years later, the center had spun off into a modest network of music rooms across the city. The repair fund covered dozens of instruments a year. The workshops trained young people not only to play, but to organize small concerts, to write budgets, to negotiate performance fees. Some alumni formed a collective that booked fair pay gigs and mentored the next cohort. The advisory board continued to publish reports. The plate remained in its case, a quiet admonition. Luna, older by a few measured years and lined politely by life, would sometimes sit at the back of the rehearsal room and listen to a beginner coax a scale out of a battered guitar. She had learned, in the months after the night on television, that dignity is built in small, repeated building blocks, one repaired string, one documented consent form, one child taught to tune by ear. Her own voice had become a tool in that labor, not because it had been heroic, but because it had been human. The title that had trailed her like a shadow, the billionaire's adopted daughter, did not disappear, but it lost its bite and its force. People learned slowly to see the person rather than the label. In the end, the plate that had been meant to humiliate served another purpose. Hung behind glass, it provoked conversation each week about consent and care. People touched the plaque beside it, the edges worn by the palms of those who wanted to remember how quickly spectacle could be mistaken for charity. The community continued to count its modest wins, the number of workshops delivered each month, the kids whose school forms were filled, the instruments repaired. These were small, measurable things. Weeks of lessons, a set of 6 monthly stipend awards, a list of 20 beneficiaries, mundane details that together made intimacy possible again. Luna never stopped being wary of headlines, but she stopped letting them map her life. She taught children to listen to each other the way musicians learn rhythm, by feeling the spaces between the beats. She taught them to ask consent before framing another person's story. And when a young singer came on stage with a battered case and a photograph in a pocket, Luna would look at the plate behind glass and then hand the guitar with both hands, not as a prop, but as an offering. There was a reverence to the exchange, an attention to the fact that someone else's dignity must not be consumed for entertainment. If people asked her after a long set and a modest round of applause what had happened the night the world watched, she would pause and say what she had learned, that a voice can break through a room and change the timbre of a moment, that institutions must be held accountable not with outrage alone, but with sustained action, and that privilege, when it appeared in the story, needed to be examined with nuance and responsibility, not as a spectacle, but as a call to repair. And sometimes, as the center closed for the night and the children had been walked home, Luna would take out the photograph and smooth the worn edges. She would play a quiet tune, one of those small songs about bread and light, and then put the photograph back into her pocket. The guitar case would be zipped, the lights would blink down, and on the foyer wall the plate would catch the last glow of the evening, white and plain, and no longer meant to teach the crowd how to feel. It had become, instead, a reminder that a single image can do harm, but a community can choose to turn that harm toward repair. If this story touched you in some way, write one word in the comments now. Silence if the room fell quiet for you at the first note, or applause if you felt the urge to clap. Your word helps measure what moves us and why we must pay attention. The world did not change with one song. It shifted slowly and stubbornly because people kept showing up to do the tedious, necessary work of care. Luna's voice continued to live in rooms too small for headlines, in the hands of children learning to tune, in the careful minutes volunteers spent filling out forms so another person could get an ID and a chance. The plate remained a caption in the story, but the story was now larger, a map of accountability, a ledger of small repairs, a promise to listen. Subscribe to hear more stories that lift quieter voices, and if you can, consider supporting a local youth music program in your community.